Thank you for tuning in today. We have a very special guest, Sister Delia Mogahed from Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU. We're going to be doing a series of webinars, inshallah, in conjunction about the American Muslim landscape. And ISPU recently did a poll of the American Muslim community in which they surveyed them and asked questions about religious identity, their politics, extremism, a variety of issues. And what I thought was really about the survey is that they had also surveyed Jews, Protestants, and Catholics, asked them the same questions, and then they compared their responses to those of the Muslim community. And there were some really trends and interesting observations that Sister Dalia is going to share with us during the webinar. So let me introduce our guest, Sister Dalia Mogahed. She is the Director of Research at ISPU, which is a think tank that focuses on Muslim issues. She's the former Executive Director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. She co-authored the book Who Speaks for Islam? What 1 Billion Muslims Really Think, with co-author John Esposito, and she was appointed by President Obama to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships in 2009. So my friend, Sister Delia, how are you doing?
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. So you are normally headquartered in DC, but you're joining us from San Francisco today, I believe it is?
Yes, I am.
All right, you're a big-time traveler.
It's wonderful to speak to all of you, and thank you for taking time to join us for this webinar. I actually think this is one of the most important studies that I've personally ever done because it comes at such a critical time where American Muslims are at the center of a very heated national conversation and very seldom a part of it. So this is a way for ordinary people to get their voices heard in a representative, scientific way to really address the questions that the country is asking. Questions like, where do Muslims stand on violence? Can you be fully Muslim and fully American? How do Muslims feel about this election? What are their priorities, and many other questions? And it was very important to us, just as Brother Hazem said, to ask the exact same questions of everyone. So we are not looking at Muslims as an isolated specimen. We are comparing across religious communities and really placing the American Muslim community within its faith landscape within the country. Mm-hmm. So I'm very excited to share these results with you. I think they're very important for outreach, for when you're talking to your neighbors and maybe presenting to church groups or anywhere else. The PowerPoint is available for your use online, as are many other tools that you can find on our website. So this is for you to use and to share with others.
And I've actually been to the ISPU website several times, and you have several publications available for free download. And it's a wealth of information that I think more of us need to make better use of. I go there on a regular basis, and I try to make use of them as much as I can. A quick and very shameless plug for ISNA. Sister Delia and ISPU are going to be at the ISNA convention in Chicago the first weekend of September, Labor Day. And she's going to be discussing many of these issues that we're going to be discussing during the webinar. So this is a great opportunity at the convention to follow up. You can meet her in person. You can pick her brains. She is one of the smartest ladies that I have ever met, and I'm very lucky to have gotten to know her. So, Sister Delia, I know that you have a presentation ready,
yep.
And so I will let you go through that for the most part uninterrupted. Then we'll have a discussion about it for a little bit, and then we'll go to Q&A where the audience gets to chime in.
Okay, wonderful.
All right, so go ahead.
So let me start very briefly by going over what I'll cover today. I'm going to talk to you about very briefly about the methodology we use to do the research. And then I will go over the topics of politics, religion, identity, and then views of violence. So our methodology, we started out by asking who can be our chief methodologist for this research. We wanted to really find the top person that that works on polling minorities. So if you're familiar with survey research, you'll know that it is very difficult to poll in a representative manner a group like the American Muslim community because we are 1 to 2% of the overall population. So we went out and found the top methodologist on polling Jewish Americans. That was David Dutwin. He sits on the board of the American Association of Survey Researchers. He specializes in Jewish American polling as well as minority polling overall. And we asked him to join our team as our chief methodologist. He was thrilled to do so. So he really advised us and also basically carried out the mechanics of the poll. What we did is we created a nationally representative sample of Muslims. We had a sample of 550. We also supplemented our sample with Jews. So we have Muslims, Jews, and then we did a general public poll where we pulled out Protestants and Catholics. They are a big enough group that we don't have to do a special poll to get them. We can just do the general public, and there's enough of them to kind of get their views out of that. Everyone was given identical surveys, as I mentioned, and the field date was earlier this year in January. And you can read, if you want, a detailed discussion of the methodology on our website at ispu.org/poll. The first thing to mention is, who are American Muslims? Well, first, they are by far the most ethnically diverse faith community in America. They're the only faith community that does not have a majority race. Okay, so every other faith community is majority white, not surprisingly, except Muslims, right? We are a mix of every race, basically. The largest groups are Asians. That would be the South Asian group, as well as Far East, but mostly South Asians. Arabs, or people who identify as Arab or white, so that group is, the white group is a little bit harder to define, but they are self-identified white. We did offer Arab as an actual option, but they did choose white. And then African Americans, who make up almost the same percentage as Asians. And it's interesting because this poll is a little different from ones I've done before with the Gallup, where African Americans actually came out as the largest group. So they are African Americans are either the largest group or the second largest, basically.
I think this is a very important slide for a couple of reasons. One, oftentimes the African American Muslim group gets left out of the discussion. And predominantly when we think of Muslims, many of us only think of Arab or think of South Asians. And so it's important to remember that our African American brothers and sisters constitute a very large portion of our American Ummah.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And there's two other groups I just want to point out. 6% of American Muslims are Hispanic, or identify as Hispanic. And this is up from 3% about 9 years ago. So the Latino community is actually the fastest growing community within our larger Muslim Ummah in America. And then 1% actually identified as Native American. And I don't think we ever think of Native Americans. It's not a very large group, but we do have Native American Muslims that are, a part of our community as well. Okay, the other thing to note about our community that's very that's unique is that we're very young. It's the youngest faith community that we surveyed. So if you look at this graph, what you'll see is, if you look at 14% are between the age of 18 and 24, 22% of Muslims are between the age of 25 and 34. And what that means, if you do the math, is that 36% are below the age of 35. And that's quite a bit higher than, say, the Jewish community. Only 17% are below the age of 35, and it's also higher than Catholics and Protestants. So the American Muslim community is very young, which translates into a lot of things. First is they tend to be the most likely to be employed. They're not as likely to be retired, so they're contributing members of society. They're also a group that is going to be growing into the future, both because of demographics, immigration, as well as conversion. So when Pew says that Muslims will be the second largest religion in America by 2050, this is one of the reasons why. It's because it's a very young community. Okay. So, jumping right into politics, as of the, when this poll was taken, which is in late January, the most popular candidate among Muslims was actually Hillary Clinton at 40%, followed by Bernie Sanders. Now, a lot of people have been surprised by this data, especially Bernie supporters. And I'll give a few caveats here to kind of explain why this might be a bit surprising. First, this is an overall look, so it's the population as a whole. When you look at young people, Bernie does, is favored over Hillary. So if the only people you talk to are people who are young, then you may be surprised by this. But if you look at the entire community, these are the numbers. It is interesting to note a few things. First, the only female candidate is most popular among Muslims. So that kind of responds to some of the stereotypes about Muslims and their acceptance of a female leader. Second, Muslims are as likely as Jews to favor Bernie Sanders. And 27 and 24 are basically statistically identical numbers. So again, another kind of response to the idea that Muslims are inherently seething with anti-Semitism. It's just simply not the case.
Dalia, a quick question, please. Between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, there's about 6%. And while that's not, it's certainly a small number, but it's not an insignificant number. How do we explain the 6% for Trump and Cruz, considering that the two of them had some very egregious and inflammatory things to say about Muslims?
Yes, I think those numbers are always somewhat surprising. But what we know is that some Muslims just don't vote based on being a Muslim, and they put other things first. I joke sometimes that maybe that 4% with with Donald Trump are just people who really don't want their mother-in-law to visit. But it could be that they have certain business interests, or he does appeal to some parts of our community in terms of his message around getting the economy back up and things like that. So people, I have talked to Muslims who support Trump, and their response is, well, everybody's Islamophobic. He's just more honest about it. Or, we think he's just saying that for his base. We don't think he's going to act on it. Or, well, I do think some Muslims are, shouldn't be coming into the country. So don't underestimate the possibility of some internalized Islamophobia in some cases. So those numbers are not as surprising to me, just because I have met people who, either discount all the Islamophobic rhetoric as like, well, that's just what you have to say, or sometimes even agree with it.
Okay.
Now, overall, Muslims tend to lean democratic. So interestingly, Muslims look a lot like Jews politically, and as I'll show you later, look more like Protestants religiously. Only 6% of Muslims identify as Republicans, so maybe those are the 6% who said that they would favor Trump or Ted Cruz, and the rest either identify as independent or democratic. Now, Muslims are the most likely community to actually be to identify as independents versus either of the two major political parties. And when you look at the independent group, many of them would say that they are politically or ideologically conservative, but they're not identifying as Republicans. And a lot of that is because of the rhetoric. It's alienating, and if the Republican Party would be more, neutral or inclusive of people, that a lot of Muslims actually share conservative values around family and maybe fiscal conservatism to some degree. But they are not able to join the Republican Party or identify because of that anti-Muslim rhetoric that has become like the signature trait almost of the Republican Party, unfortunately, versus some of the other things that they used to stand for. And so they end up in this independent piece, in this independent group, instead of being in the Republican side. But the other thing to also see is that because Muslims are so there's such a large percentage who are independent, they can be won over. They really are a community that, especially in swing states where it's important, that they should be a group that both parties are really reaching out to and trying to court, because they are the most likely to be able to switch back and forth. And so what that big independent portion means overall is Muslims are much more likely to vote based on priorities and policies than partisanship. They are not just going to, necessarily straight down the line vote for one party or the other, like many other communities tend to. So what are the top priorities for the American Muslim community? They are the economy, civil rights, and education. And the economy and jobs is by far the most important. And then after that comes bigotry, civil rights, and then education. What's interesting about this is Muslims look as a community, as an overall community, almost are identical in terms of their their priorities as are African Americans, with the exception of immigration being something that's important to the community, the Muslim community, and not to the Black community. The other thing to note is that, like African Americans and Democrats, quote, national security doesn't make it in the top one or two categories of priorities. And that is different from the Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant communities as faith groups. Now, this will be something some people will look at and say, well, wait a minute, Muslims are, soft on terrorism. Why isn't national security their top thing? Well, what this really is, if you look at this graph, as a survey researcher, this question is asked all the time, and it's been asked for like almost 100 years in America, which is like, whoever the next president is, what do you think the most important issue is? This is like a graph of people's fears. This is like a national fear map. And people are responding to what they are most afraid of, what is top of mind. For the American Muslim community, that is economic insecurity, followed by bigotry. Very similar to the African American community, very similar to Democrats, and especially liberal Democrats. It's not that these people are soft on terror. They are simply not, it's not their top of mind, top fear. And when you actually look at, objective data, what people should actually be afraid of in terms of what is really a threat to them is not terrorism. There is almost no chance of being killed by terrorists. You have a better chance of being killed by furniture or a toddler, and all these statistics we always hear. Yet people are still so afraid. And so it is more of I would say, a more rational reflection of what people should be afraid of than some of the rest of the country, because these things are more of a problem for Muslims and African Americans and people who tend to lean democratic. It is about economic security. It is about education. It is about bigotry and civil rights.
Is it odd Dalia, that I think among the Catholic and Protestant communities, right, those are the two communities that actually had national security as their top concern. And yet it seems to me like they are the least likely group to be the target of violence or terrorism. I mean, certainly the African American community, I think, would be the biggest target, and yet even national security is even less of a priority for them, right? And they're less safe, right? We've all seen the police brutality and what it's like to live in some of the inner cities and so on. So I think, to me, the media has a lot to do with this. I think, is it possible that the Catholic and Protestant communities have been, I don't want to say brainwashed, but they have been told again and again and again that you are not safe and national security is a top priority. And even though, as you mentioned, statistically speaking, the data does not suggest that they are any less safe than anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a reflection of media coverage. It is a direct reflection of media coverage and media coverage that is targeting these communities. They tend to be older. They tend to be more white. I mean, the Catholic community has a sizable Latino, portion, but other than that, they are entirely, almost entirely white, and that is a reflection of media that is targeting this demographic. It's interesting that Catholics, which is really surprising to me, are the most likely community to actually support Trump. And it's a direct reflection of this prioritization and privileging of national security as such a top priority. So fear is driving people to make political decisions that may seem odd to us, especially Catholics with their history, with the rhetoric that was leveled against their community just 100 years ago, that is identical to what Trump is now saying about Muslims, about Mexicans, about other people, the xenophobia, and yet, a complete, for some of them, not everybody, of course, some of them not really taking that into account and having that high support for a candidate that is very xenophobic. And yes, you're right about the media being such a huge factor in that. So it's not surprising that these are the the priorities of Muslims, because they are the most likely faith community in America to report religious-based discrimination. So the question is, because a lot of people get this confused, how often, if at all, have you experienced discrimination in the past year because of your religion? So this is not because of your race, this is not because of your gender or anything else, this is just asking about religious-based discrimination. And almost 1 in 5, this is an incredibly high number, almost 1 in 5 say they are experiencing this kind of discrimination regularly. And the majority say that they have experienced it at some point, whether it's occasionally or rarely, but there has been some experience of discrimination in the last year, with only 38% saying that they haven't experienced it. Now, the Jewish community has also reports religious-based discrimination. We usually think of anti-Semitism as the biggest problem, in terms of religious discrimination. But look at the numbers: 5% of Jews compared to 18% of Muslims report regular religious discrimination. And yet, when you talk to the FBI, they say, "Well, I don't understand what your problem is. We don't hear anything. The only hate crimes we hear about are from Jews." And they will say like 90% of hate crimes reported are from the Jewish community. Well, that's just doesn't make sense when you look at this data. And so what is happening is that Muslims are not reporting these incidents. I mean, it's so underreported that the government is not taking it seriously enough. And I think that's a really important issue to try to fix. Now, when you look at who among the Muslim American community is being harassed or perceiving to have been discriminated against, you find that basically there are three groups that are the most likely to have experienced some level of discrimination? Women, young people 18 to 29, and people with a high school degree or less, people who haven't gone to college. So essentially, it's the most vulnerable among us that are experiencing the bulk of the discrimination. Women, because possibly they're more visible, and then young people and people without a college education are getting the brunt of Islamophobic discrimination. Now, one of the questions I had as a researcher is, what does discrimination do to people? How does it change them, or how does it impact their views of things? So we looked at this and we compared people who had experienced, this is Muslims now, we compared Muslims who had experienced no discrimination to Muslims who say that they experienced regular discrimination. And we wanted to see if there were any differences. We looked at like every question. We looked at views of violence. We looked at their sense of their American identity, their sense of their Muslim identity. And we found no differences at all on anything except for these two items. So people who say that they've experienced no discrimination are more likely to be satisfied with the overall direction of the country than Muslims who say that they've experienced regular discrimination. Okay, not surprising, and it's quite a significant difference. The thing that made us the sort of more surprising one was this one, that people who had experienced no discrimination were actually less likely to be involved in their community than people who had experienced regular discrimination. The majority of people who have experienced regular discrimination say that they have worked with other people from their neighborhood to fix a problem or improve a condition in their community. So discrimination seems to link with less optimism and more activism. So overall, this is probably the most surprising result that I found, was that Muslims are the most satisfied community in America with the direction of the country, and with President Obama as a president, in terms of his performance. So 63% are satisfied with the direction of the country, and 78%, like the highest approval rating of the president among any group, approve of the president. The direction of the country may reflect, and it usually does reflect, how you feel about the president. Muslims are not always satisfied with the direction of the country. So sometimes I've had people look at this data and say, well, Muslims they get it all wrong in every way. They're like, oh, Muslims are all immigrants, so they're just happy not to be in the old country, and they're just satisfied no matter what. That is completely wrong. First of all, under Bush, right, you remember him, George W. Bush, Muslims were incredibly dissatisfied. In fact, their approval rating of President Bush was 7%, okay, 7% compared to 78%. So there was a huge difference, and their satisfaction with the direction of the country was also in the single digits. So this is actually a reflection of how people are feeling about this president, and generally agree with his policies. It doesn't mean that they like the rhetoric of the election, but that right now he's the one in charge, and this is how they're feeling about the country. Now, as far as political engagement, there's sort of good news and bad news. The good news first is that Muslims are equally likely to be engaged in their community. They are volunteering, they are working with people at the grassroots level to improve problems or to solve problems in their neighborhood and in their community, as likely as Jews to say that or to report that. But they're far, far less likely to be registered to vote, and they're even less likely to plan to vote. So there's sort of two problems here. One is that the Muslim registration of for voting is only at 60%, compared to 86% of Jews, 95% of Catholics, 94% of Protestants. Almost every Catholic and Protestant And vast majority of Jews are registered to vote, and 60% of Muslims are. And just so that you're not wondering if this is because some Muslims aren't citizens, we only ask this of people who are eligible to vote. So this is 60% of eligible Muslim voters. The other issue is that 85% plan to vote. So you have this 25% difference between the ones who are ready to vote and the ones who are planning to vote. We call this group, right, the quarter of us, the inshallah voters. So they're going to vote, inshallah, but they have not taken the actual steps to be able to vote. And our recommendation strongly is that this is the group we have to focus on in the short term, not the group that is the 15% who are saying we're not even planning to vote. The 15% who don't even want to vote, that's a group we have to work on if we want to, increase Muslim political engagement. We have to work on that group long term. The group that needs to be focused on right now for these next few months is that 25% inshallah voters who want to vote but haven't gotten around to registering.
By the way, politicians are very aware of this. This data is public knowledge. Whether or not you voted, which party you registered for, they don't say who you voted for, right? But most other information is there, and candidates and politicians and political parties pay very close attention to this. So they know that Muslims are less likely to vote. And that's one of the reasons that the Muslim community as a whole is still politically weak, as opposed to, for example, the Jewish community, which is about the same percentage of the population, but enjoys much better representation in the government and a lot more political say than Muslims do.
That's exactly right. Some people aren't aware of this, but there's lists out there of the names of people who voted. It's true that it's not public who you voted, but it is public if you voted. If you voted is public, and I will be in meetings with people who are running for office, and we'll tell them, you need to talk to the Muslim constituents in your district, and they will literally come back and say only 7 of them voted in the last election. They'll actually give us the number, and the number is embarrassing. Or only 37% voted. I'm sorry, 37 voted, not 37%. Of 100,000 people in their district, okay, so a place like Michigan, where Muslims should be dictating policy because of their numbers, the elected officials will literally come back and say, yes, the numbers are this, but only 37 people, not 37%, actually voted in the last election. And that matters. I mean, one really scary data point, I'm just going to share it with you just to explain this. Flint, Michigan, and all the disastrous problems that it is dealing with in terms of its water problem. 4 miles away, in another city, very close by, their pipes were changed and they had no problem. 4 miles away. Now, there are lots of differences between these two cities, but one difference I'll share with you is that Flint's voter turnout is 12%, and that other city 4 miles away is 70%. And that can actually be, in some cases, the difference between life and death. It is that important to show political leaders that you are engaged in, that you matter, or they will just ignore you. And that's, I think, a very important point to take home. So we actually ask people, why do you vote and why don't you vote? And I think this is important in crafting messaging around helping people to come to vote. So why do people vote? Their reasons are Muslims. Why do they vote? Civic duty. I want to make a difference. I want to make sure a specific candidate is not elected. And it's my right. It's an important right and freedom I want to exercise. Okay. This is what people said they don't want to vote. That 15% said, I don't plan to vote. I'm not registered. I don't want to vote. Voting is not something I'm interested in. Here's why. They say my vote doesn't matter, doesn't count, won't make a difference. I don't like any of the options. That's something that we hear all the time. And the issues I care about are not represented by any candidate. Now, two things to notice is that basically the key difference between people who want to vote and people who don't is if they think it matters, if they think they can make a difference, and if they think that it really, you know, it will count. But the second thing to notice is that we actually didn't hear anyone say it was haram to vote. It's not a question, it's not an answer we heard, and we even had it pre-coded. We had it as to religiously wrong to vote or whatever. We anticipated hearing that, and we never heard it from a single respondent. So that obstacle seems to have been overcome to some degree, or at least it's a minority, a very small minority. The bigger issue now.
We seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties. We're getting Sister Delia back. Delia, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. We lost you there.
Okay, no problem. So we wanted to look at what was what was connected to more civic engagement. We found that people who attended a mosque frequently, once a week or more, were much more likely to report cooperating with people in their community, so greater civic engagement, more likely to be registered to vote, and more likely to plan to vote. So mosque attendance, frequent mosque attendance, is actually linked to greater civic engagement. The very thing we want, the very thing we want to encourage. And this is why I often say that mosques are a moderating factor in America. To say that we're going to close the mosques to end radicalization is exactly the opposite of what we should do. Here, a lot of times Muslims are sort of portrayed as fanatics or, religiously different from everyone else, and it's actually not the case at all. Muslims are very similar to actually the biggest religious community in America, which are Protestants. They're almost identical in the frequency of mosque attendance, for example, how often they attend a religious service, and in how important religion to them. In fact, Catholics and Protestants are slightly more likely, although not by much, to say that religion is important to them. The other thing I'll mention very briefly, because ISNA has made this such an important part of their work, is that the percentage of Muslims who say that they attend a mosque once a week or more, 42%. When you stat by gender, men and women, it is almost the same. So women are almost as likely as men to attend a mosque. They are coming to the mosque with equal frequency or nearly equal frequency. And the question we need to ask is our resources, space allocations, programming reflective of this reality? Or are we still operating from an old set of assumptions that think that Muslim women or women in general are half as likely as men to go to the mosque, or there's not as many women as men who are at the mosque? And it's not the case. Despite all of the issues and the alienation that women do many times experience, they are still attending at equal rates, and therefore our mosques need to respond to this reality with allocation of resources accordingly. Now here's a question that I actually thought was very important in terms of religion. What about the role of religion in law? This idea of Sharia and all this scary stuff. So we actually wanted to ask the question across the board. What comes closest to your point of view? Your religion should be the main source of American law. Your religion should be a source of American law, but not the only source, or your religion should not be a source of American law. Okay, so the answer is this. Protestants are the most likely to want religion as law in America, not Muslims. But Muslims aren't far behind. So there's a couple things to sort of take note. First, the majority of Muslims say they don't want religion to be, or their religion to be a part of American law. But they're similar to Protestants in the likelihood of wanting their religion to be reflected in American law. I think that this is an important point, because when a Protestant says they want to advocate for X, Y, or Z policy out of their religious beliefs, nobody freaks out. It's normal, right? It's normal for religious people to want to see their values. Everybody is advocating for their values to be reflected in their law, and religious people draw their values from their religion. Nothing scary about that. And when you are able to ask everyone the same question, it appears as clear as this. It's Muslims are Americans. They are people of faith, just as Protestants are, and nothing is unusual about this kind of result. I think this is the best pushback against the craze of the sort of creeping Sharia idea. Is people are, citizens of America are as entitled as anyone else, and that actually, if you're going to worry about religion and law, you should be worrying about creeping Protestant law, especially since they are 30-40% of the population versus 1% of the population. So I think that this is an important piece of data, and I think it needs to be explained and unpacked properly. Now the question being identity. Can you have a strong American identity and a strong Muslim identity? It really kind of goes back to this other idea. Across the board, people of all faiths have a strong American identity, and Muslims are no different. Their religious and their American identity is basically equally strong. Now, we wanted to ask a different question. Oftentimes, the idea is that these two identities are trade-offs, right? If you have a strong religious identity, that means necessarily you have a weak religious identity. I'm sorry, if you have a strong religious identity, you have a weak American identity. That they are sort of in competition. Now, the only way to test that is to actually ask the two questions separately and then to see how they are linked. And here's what we found. People with a strong religious identity in the Muslim community are actually more likely than people with a weak religious identity to say they have a strong American identity. So this graph shows the percentage of people in the Muslim community with a strong American identity. And it's 91% among people with strong Muslim identity, identification, and only 68% among Muslims with a weak religious identity. So it sort of settles this question of, are these two identities compatible? They're not only compatible, they're not only not in competition, but in fact, they're perhaps even mutually reinforcing.
Delia, if I could ask about that, that's an issue that's been part of American history ever since America has existed. This idea that if you're one thing, therefore you're not American. Jews went through it, Catholics went through it, Irish went through it, the Japanese went through it. It's a cycle that keeps repeating over and over and over again. The majority seem to reject this up-and-coming minority. And what can we do as a community to prove to everybody else, even though we shouldn't necessarily have to prove, but that's the situation that we're in, to prove to them that, look, I'm a Muslim, I value my faith, and I'm a proud Muslim, but that doesn't make me any less American. How do we package that in a way that is convincing to those that are most skeptical of us?
I think we have to ask the question, what does it mean to be an American? And I think that's actually at the heart of this question. Because what it meant to be a real American was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Then that definition was expanded to include Jews. Then it was expanded to include Catholics. Then it was expanded to include non-Anglo-Saxons, right? Italians could also be Americans and so forth. And it just kept expanding until it included more and more people. But we all remember that in not so long ago, Japanese Americans weren't seen as real Americans, and they were taken and unjustly detained and imprisoned just because of their identity. So it's not so much that, Japanese Americans, if you look at their history, they were third, fourth generation Americans, but they look different. And it was the problem, the heart of the problem was this challenge of what does it mean to be an American? Is it defined by a culture and a creed? Is it the way you look? Or is it an idea, a concept? Our founding documents seem to say that it's actually a concept. It's a set of values. It's a set of ideas that anyone can subscribe to. That's why we're different, supposedly, from Europe, and where it is about an ethnicity, and that's how the nation state is sort of created. We were supposed to be different from that. So we have to continuously remind our country to live up to its founding values, that it hasn't yet, and it, we need to challenge it to grow toward these aspirational values that it claims to uphold. I don't think it's about what we do as much as it is about reinforcing and reminding people of what America is supposed to be defined as. Because the reason we're not seen as American, I wrote an article about this, is if you kind of go through all of the reasons that could be, they don't really hold up. It ends up being, at the end of the day, a definition. When you look at the subtext of everything that someone like Trump says, it's really about a real American looks like this. Everyone else is here on our good graces. We're the real Americans. We're the host. We're the hosts, and everyone else is a guest, or should be a grateful servant to us. And that paradigm has to be exposed, and I think that's the only way that this idea will not keep emerging.
Thank you.
Okay, and then finally, we looked at views of violence. We looked at it in two ways. One is, how justified is it for a military to attack and basically to target and kill civilians? And how justified is it for an individual to target and kill civilians? So the first one with military is the definition, according to the Geneva Convention, of a war crime. Okay, this is not okay. You cannot target and kill civilians if you're a military. That is a war crime. The second one is basically the definition of, conventional terrorism as we understand it. So 65% of Muslims say that it is never justified to target and kill civilians. And unfortunately, the majority of the rest of the country thinks it's sometimes justified. So when you have numbers in the 40s that say it's never justified to commit a war crime, it is a bit concerning. And I really think this is the headline here. But it's not something anyone wants to talk about. I think it's really problematic. I think we need to re-educate ourselves on how to hold our military accountable and what we think it's okay for our military to do. Now, the second piece is on terrorism overall, and Muslims are as likely as other people of faith in America to say it's never justified. And this is, again, where it becomes very important to ask the question across the board, not just of one group, where the headline would have been very different had we only asked Muslims this question because, oh my God, it's 81%. Well, what does that mean? 19% think it's okay. 19% of Muslims, how many, what percentage of that? It's a 19% of 7 million. This many people are. I mean, that's what always happens with polls that are misinterpreted. But when you do it properly and you have a cross section of America, then data can be interpreted within context.
And I think that was, as I had mentioned, that was one of the things about this study that I really liked, is the context. Now we know where we are relative to everybody else. We have just a few minutes left, so to the audience, if you have a question, please go ahead and post it in the chat room. We will, hopefully we'll have a few minutes to get to it, inshallah. Also, this webinar will be archived and it will be available for viewing in the future, and we will email links to everybody who registered for this event. So I have, before we get to some of the questions from the viewers, I thought it was really important. One of the key findings that you had mentioned is that 87% of Muslims say that religion is really important in their lives. To me, that's very reassuring. Religion is something that people truly care about. Something that you and I have spoken about regularly, and something you had alluded to, is the lack of people coming to the masajid on a regular basis. You know, the masajid are full during Jummah prayer, but then the rest of the week, really there aren't the activities and there isn't the life and the action that all of us would like to see, despite the fact that religion plays an important role and we want to be more involved. So what does that mean for us as a community, and what do we need to do so that the activity in the masajid reflects the fact that 87% of Muslims take this religion seriously?
I mean, I think that's a great question. You know, I'll put a plug in for a project that ISP is working on. It's called Reimagining Muslim Spaces, and we're actually trying to answer that question. How can we make our mosques more inclusive, more engaging, more vibrant, more relevant to people who are interested in being a part of a religious community, but for some reason or another feel a certain alienation at the mosque, or feel that there's an obstacle to attending. So I think that there's a lot of work to do, and this data just kind of underscores the urgency.
Yeah, you had mentioned the top priorities for different groups: economy, jobs, immigration, things of that nature. How often do these priorities change, or are these pretty much set and there's not much change there?
No, they change quite frequently, and it really depends on people's basically what's in the media. You know, it's interesting. You look at something like national security or terrorism. This was like not even the seventh most important priority among people, like as of 3 years ago. Before the rise of, maybe you could say the rise of ISIS, or before this election cycle. This wasn't something on people's minds. They were focused entirely on the economy. So it really depends on what is in the news and what people are told to be scared of. So there's a whole theory called well, it's a whole idea that I would encourage you to read about. It's called agenda setting theory. Agenda setting theory. It's basically, it says that you can predict public opinion almost to the number by doing media content analysis. There's companies that do this for for corporations to actually tell them what their stock price will be just by looking at what their media coverage is, and they will predict, like, and they have a specific time lag. So if the media says this, or this is the content analysis of the media today, public opinion will reflect this in 2 weeks, and they have it to the day. I mean, it's scary how much the media dictates our perceptions. And this idea of agenda setting theory means that the media tells you what you should be thinking about. So what should be on your agenda? What should be important to you? And so these fears, this fear map, as I call it, is a reflection of the media, basically.
Yeah. So regarding voting, I know that this is going to be a real issue this year. What do you say to Muslims who think that their vote doesn't count?
Well, I would say, we are a small number, and I agree with that. Of course, we're 1% of the population, but in some key districts and in some key swing states, we can make the difference. You know, and a lot of times people will point out that Bush won his first election by a few hundred votes, and there were like 4,000 Muslims in that district. So Muslims actually may have been the reason Bush was elected that year. If they had swung to the other side, he wouldn't have been elected because of that discrepancy in Florida. So that's one thing. They can make a difference. But more important than that, I think, is that when you show politicians that your community is engaged, that they are voting at a 70, 80, 90% rate, every single Muslim is going out and voting, they're going to court you. They're going to meet with you. They're going to take your policy priorities seriously. If you're not voting and giving, you don't count. you're invisible to them.
And
And I think that's what really makes a difference.
I think the best evidence of that is the Jewish community, because the Jewish community is also 1 to 2%, but they enjoy a tremendous amount of political clout. And so, if another group can do it, then we can certainly do it. And I would also add to that, when it comes to voting, many of us focus on the presidential election. But state and local elections are tremendously important. And this is where Muslims can make a big difference. We can have a huge impact, because it's not uncommon for local elections, for local councilmen or state senators, or for elections to be won by a small handful of people. A few hundred, a few thousand max can change the outcome of a vote tremendously. A friend of mine, Nadine Mazen, who is a city councilman in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? Mm-hmm. He won an election by 7 votes. 7, not 70, not 700, not 7,000, 7 votes, right? I mean, for many of us, that's just our siblings, right? If all of your siblings go to vote, that can make the difference between you winning the election and not winning the election. So local elections matter.
Yep. Absolutely.
Well, and the other thing is, what can Masajid do? What can Masajid do to encourage people? Because if we are getting people for Jummah and we have a captive audience, and you have linked greater attendance in the Masajid to greater civic engagement, it seems to me like there's a lot of potential for the Masajid to drive the community in the right direction.
I think if it was up to me, there would be a voter registration drive every single Jummah from now until November. Every single week. It doesn't take a lot of work. It's a half an hour after Jummah. That's it. Just set it up, sit there. You can even sometimes get other people, non-Muslims, to come. The League of Women Voters are phenomenal. They will come and sit there themselves if you don't want to do it. There's so many people, there's so many groups out there who want to increase American civic engagement and will help us. So I think every masjid has to do that. And then I was disappointed that, the last Eid prayer, right, which had tons of people everywhere came to the Eid al-Fitr, Salat Eid al-Fitr, and I didn't see voter registration booths, at least the place I went. This is a lost opportunity. We need to have one definitely at Eid al-Adha. Definitely, absolutely, it is absolutely crucial. Eid al-Adha is going to land basically on September 11th. So it's enough time. I mean, the date is going to be something we have to navigate, but it's enough time before the election that even in states where you have to be registered a full month before, it's enough time to be able to do that. And I highly recommend that we do that, especially because this idea of the 25% who want to vote but haven't gotten around to it, they just need a nudge. It's not a lot of work to get 25% of the community registered. And that's who we should be focusing on. I think skeptics are a waste of our time right now. We need to, we always want to focus on them. Oh, how do we convince these people who think it's not whatever? Forget about it. We have so many, we have sort of low-hanging fruit that we can just do the tiniest bit of effort and get a huge benefit from. And that's what we should focus today and now until the election. The other folks who don't want to vote, we have to talk to them long-term, and that's a different issue.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Sister Dalia. I know that you're very busy, but you took time out of your day
thank you for holding this, and thank you to everyone who joined us and everyone that will watch later.
Yeah, thank you to everybody out in internet land. Thank you for tuning in. Again, this will be archived, it will be documented, and you can share it with other people. We will be having a follow-up webinar with ISPU in a few months. If you have not been to ISPU's site, I highly encourage you to do so. Support ISPU. The work and the data and the findings that they produce help support all Muslim organizations and individuals and activists, including ISNA. So ISPU is a great organization, and they're one that need our support. The convention, do not forget about the convention, Labor Day weekend, first weekend in September in Chicago. Dalia and ISPU are going to be there. You've got several sessions at the convention coming up, so you can interact with Dalia and a host of other leaders. So be sure to mark your calendar and be on the lookout for the upcoming webinar, inshallah. Dalia, thank you again. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody out in